Hey guys, what is up? Kid here, Burn One, Shadowverse Evolve channel. As always, we're bringing you a tier list that's going to be myself this time. I'm just going to give you kind of my thoughts on the current BP07 meta, due to the fact that this meta is actually a little long. I'm actually going to do this introductory tier list, and as the meta develops a little bit more, if I think there's any changes that need to be done to this tier list in about a month or so, I'll update the tier list then. Just to see where everything kind of shakes out. But these are my initial thoughts of where I think the current powerhouses are in this format. So starting off, surprisingly, we'll just go down the line here. I have Fable Forest. Been playing around with this deck and versus this deck mostly a lot, and surprisingly the new Cheshire Cat and Mad Hatter are actually crazy cards for the deck, and it changes how the deck feels and what kind of pressure you can apply to your opponent. Pressure has been playing it against me a lot lately for fun, and the deck seems really solid. The deck is almost real. It just feels like part of the win conditions and stuff aren't good enough, but all the pieces to run the deck feel really good because we already know all the Fable stuff is very powerful. The Mad Hatter is actually quite obnoxiously good. I was quite impressed with that card, of how good that card actually turned out to be. I already had a feeling it was kind of like a pretty decent card, but actually seeing it in action and playing against it, it's very powerful. The things you can do with it are insane. The consistency it adds to the deck, the hand advantage you get from just playing all these Fable cards together that keep generating cards. You got Alice and Mad Hatter coming out, pulling out extra cards over and over again. So you're not necessarily losing too much value as the game goes on. The deck definitely plays more of like a tempo deck game plan, and you kind of threaten the Beauty and the Beast at the end, like, hey, at any point you just like let your guard down. This Beauty and the Beast that I put 5 counters on in the back row in the EX zone can come out and kind of end the game starting from, I think, like turn 7, turn 8 or so. The only issue with the deck is sometimes it just doesn't get there because you don't have the right tempo. Your opponent can like pop off before you can actually like win the game. It's very interesting how the deck plays out itself into certain matchups. Unfortunately, I don't think it's powerful enough. It's not necessarily doing anything broken like some other decks are currently doing. It's just a really fair Fable Forest list, and I like that about the deck a lot. I wish it was a bit better, but unfortunately we're getting to that point in the game where your deck has to be kind of broken in the sense of doing some crazy stuff to really get going and everything like that. Next here I have Machina Rune. This deck, just fair warning, a lot of this is theory crafting wise for as how good I think the deck is going to be. I have not played or tested this deck yet. It's on my to-do list, but it's also one of the few decks that I don't really have much like desire to really grind the deck out into the ground. With that being said, I talked a lot over with Pressure and some other people who have been testing the deck and everything like that. The deck does feel good from their opinions and everything, and I trust their opinion on this. The deck can function very well. The issue, once again, is unlike all the other decks in this format, it's kind of like a semi-fair deck. You don't really get to do anything too crazy. Right now, I think if you're going to play a rune list, you just probably play the updated Kuon list. Is probably going to be more consistent than Machina Rune. It is what it is. Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything like too crazy like Mono does, but it's still a very fun, solid deck to play around. It obviously can take games off of tier 1 decks and tier 2 decks, but it's not going to be consistently doing that every time. So I'm going to be putting this into the tier 3. Next on the list here is Mono. Mono was one of the most represented decks in Japan during this format. I think it had the most wins in general. Not by a huge margin, but a decent enough margin that it was clear that Japan favored Mono. I've been playtesting Mono a lot. Personally, I don't think I would take this to a regional, in my opinion. The only way I would take this to a regional is that I grinded this deck to the ground, because this is a deck that punishes you very hard for not understanding matchups and making bad decisions. If you are a really good player at making very good decisions throughout the game and setting up lethals over and over again and everything like that, Mono, the more time you put into Mono will probably pay off for you a lot more. But if you're someone that needs to be able to like kind of make a slight mistake here and there, this is probably not the deck for you, because a lot of times one minor mistake can lead into a snowball effect of where you just lose the game, because you either lose too much hand size, you have no more gas, you end up like messing up some of your EX zone placements, so suddenly your Gensetsus aren't doing anything just because you have either too many things in your EX zone or not enough space in your EX zone to get enough foxes onto the board. then from there, the mono deck so far feels very much like you have to know everything your opponent's going to be doing and play around everything to set up certain board states. The deck is very much a figuring out what kind of board states you can set up and whether you're going to play a game around Gensetsu or a game around doing mono into Gensetsu or double mono and so forth. The deck has a lot of potential of like a very crazy high ceiling, but at the same time you're sitting there with that double-edged sword there with a really low floor. So if you make a mistake, and you can just lose the game on the spot essentially from one mistake. I do think the deck is very powerful. Personally, I know a lot of people probably aren't very high on this deck because I do think the skill gap between like someone who grinds the deck into the dirt and knows all the matchups versus someone who picks it up on the side just for fun. I think they're going to be night and day difference between those players for sure. But the thing is, I think you got to be able to invest the time and invest that much resources into like learning every mono matchup. I do want to put this in tier 1. I think that's kind of controversial in the sense that I think a lot of people might not feel like it's tier 1, but I'm going to put it in tier 1. Worst case scenario, it's top of tier 2. I feel like mono is like the benchmark of if you're good enough to compete with mono, then you have a chance to like be in tier 1. That's at least my opinion so far. I think it's kind of like the gatekeeper of like things that forces things down into tier 2, and then things that can beat mono have a chance to be in tier 1 pretty much. Next here is Machina Haven. I know some people are kind of high on this deck. After playing against it a lot, I have not personally played the deck myself just yet, but I played a lot of games into it with some very good players. For example, Ryan Wibberley, who recently got second place at Houston. He's played this deck a bunch against me as well. Deck feels very good. The Limonia is a very good card. It's Regeki on a body. It feels good. Unfortunately, the only issue with the deck is, once again, I think one of the big issues with Haven a lot of the times is it has some very great control tools and some solid followers all around. The issue is that you just never have a very like explosive way to finish games. A lot of times, a lot of these games that I played into this deck, it comes down to really just playing the resource game until your opponent can't answer your board anymore. Which is it's a solid game plan into certain decks like mono and things like that. So obviously Limonia and Machina Haven is going to be a really powerful deck into mono and kind of most likely just kind of push that deck out of the way. I assume a lot of the times, depending on how the Haven player opens up with Machina, they should be able to compete or beat mono. I would say a majority of the time, like maybe 60-40 in that sense. Mono still does, unlike Haven, has that explosive power to like randomly steal games from them, which is one of the reasons I think mono is a little bit higher than tier 2, just because of the explosiveness it has. Like I said, with mono, very high ceiling, very low floor. So if you're happy with those type of decks, obviously mono is good for you. If you like a very fair deck that's looking to control the board and try to win out through attrition and some advantages that way, I think Machina Haven would be up your alley. Personally, I think it's a tier 2 deck. I know I've seen some people put it in tier 1, other people's put it in tier 2. I think it's a very solid tier 2 deck. I think this is one of these other decks that's just like, if you're as good as this deck, you can probably be in tier 2 fairly consistently. Next here, we have Amata's, basically Pixie Forest. We got some new additions with Pixie Forest, which I like. It added some extra consistency. I'm forgetting the name of the card, but it's the 1-drop spell that gives power to some Pixie followers, and then you can draw a card on combo 3. I like cards like that, especially for that type of deck, because there's a lot of turns on turns 5 and 6 or so, where you get to get the Spinaria and the Anastasia turns and stuff like that. Kind of pop off on those turns, and that's when you can build a really huge board. And if your opponent can't answer a relatively stacked board after like a turn 5 or 6, when you're able to push up some whiffs or whatever from that scenario, and you get the power pump with Anastasia and things like that, I think that's when the deck can take control of a lot of games. But you're still kind of like an Amata's deck, which means you have the opportunity of, I opened up the aggro high roll hand where I'm just like bouncing Amata's back to my hand, replaying it over and over again to just start pushing early damage as hard as possible. In this meta, I think a lot of the best decks in the format are currently like mid-rangey decks that have like really good burst before like the hard control decks can really win games. And Avatars can kind of sneak around that easily in that sense if you open up the correct way, as well as if you're able to get a really good turn 5, turn 6 pop off turn by building a really wide board, and you don't get punished that hard immediately after. A lot of times you can take control of the game from there and just kind of slowly whittle your opponent out over the course of the next 2 turns or so. Sometimes even 1 turn is all you really need, depending on how you open, how much pressure you put in earlier in the game. I really like this deck still. I think it takes a little bit more finesse, and sometimes some of the matchups I feel like you're going to have to just kind of open up the high roll hand to be able to win the game. But with all that being said, I still think it's a really, really solid tier 2 deck, so I'm going to put it into tier 2. I might change my opinion on this later. It really depends, but from my testing so far and from my friends playing into me a lot with Pixie Forest and stuff like that, I still get the feeling that the deck is very powerful for what it is. Next, Natra Forest. This one, I'm not sure if this is going to be controversial or not, but I think this deck is actually a tier 1 deck. I'm not exactly sure on the exact list you should be playing, but my overall games into this deck a lot of the times, I think it competes very well into what I will consider the other tier 1 decks. I don't think it necessarily has a super favored matchup as necessarily into every deck in tier 1, but it for sure has a solid matchup into mono for sure. And then the other matchups in tier 1 are just going to be, I would say, like maybe a 50-50. It really depends on how each person draws and how and the biggest thing, as always with Forest, I feel like, is like the draw order of certain cards, because you need to be able to combo off usually on turn 5 with enough tree tokens in the EX zone to be able to set up the board. You get a push 7 damage while also blowing up the board. One of the biggest draws, I think, to wanting to play Forest in this meta is that Cinnamon packing with Latica. It feels so good. Latica gives you that extra push and oomph you need for Forest to really become a more pressured mid-range deck that also has like very strong board control. The fact that the turn 5 plays with Cinnamon packing is so important for the deck. I think the games you see Cinnamon packing Latica by like turn 5 and 6 are so wildly different if you see those cards like a turn later than that, on like turn 7 or so. It's still a really, really strong like combo necessarily, but it's just like those turn 5 plays, if you're able to make the Latica play and blow up their board and get like 3 or 4 followers off the board in 1 turn, you feel so good, because not only does that mean that they can't necessarily start swinging in and ignore your board anymore, they have to remove the Latica because it's still a 7/7 on the board. I've had some cases too where playing against this deck, I would be at like 9 total life or whatever, and they were able to like use Cinnamon packing a couple times to just bump it up enough, along with like the Anastasia buff or something, or on Latica, to really push the extra damage to make sure to close out the game that way. I've had that happen to me once or twice, which has been pretty fun, because a lot of times in those matchups I'll be playing and be like, well, I only lose if they're able to combo 5 in Latica Evo with double Cinnamon packing to get enough power onto the board that turn, and it happens sometimes, which is obnoxious. One of the other things I really like about this deck too is that we get to play Ancient Elf too, if that's something you would like. I think Ancient Elf is relatively powerful into everything except for essentially any Abyss deck that runs that I'm forgetting the name of the card, but it's the IMAX card that just destroys 3-cost or lower. That card, unfortunately, for 2 play points, answers Ancient Elf very well when you're looking to get really good value off of Ancient Elf. But Ancient Elf in this Natra deck feels really good, because you can get rid of some of your tokens on board by bouncing them away and still getting a draw ditch from that to kind of set things up and like dig into your deck a little bit easier without having to spend extra play points on popping the amulets yourself. And then another thing too is I think is it a 9-drop or something into a 7/7? That card adds so much extra consistency if you get into the later parts of the game and you're able to pop like 4 Natra cards. What's cool about that too is it's not necessarily looking for tokens, though that was like the main game plan. But I've had games where my opponent will like swing in with a couple things, push up a couple trees, pop everything, even the followers, to play that to bring back like Latica and stuff like that, which has felt really annoying when that does happen. I think if you like a very more of a mid-range control game plan and you want to have like a really good board clear, I think Latica is the deck for you. Natra Forest, it's a really good deck. I'm considering like playing this deck myself a lot more the more I play into it. And like I've played around with Latica so far, even in some like janky builds of Forest where I just put a lot of good stuff Forest instead of like leaning towards the Natra package stuff with Latica. And Latica is such a good card. I can't emphasize that enough. Latica very much with Send and Packing, I feel like carries that the Natra deck a lot. It's just a really great card. So I'm going to throw this up into tier 1 here. Next, Natra Sword. Personally, I think this is most likely the best deck in format. I feel like it has weaknesses for sure. Like it into the mono matchup, if you're not seeing your removal on time, you can just kind of get blown out by mono. And I think that's one of the reasons in Japan this deck didn't thrive as much as it could. I think mono bullied it to be not the best deck in the format in Japan. But depending how the West accepts mono, and if we get a lot of good mono players, then maybe we're looking at, you know, mono once again being a bit of a bully. And then I think it's more of like a Natra, Forest, and mono being two of the best decks in the format. But right now, my initial impressions with Natra Sword is that it's a very powerful deck. I like that there is enough room in the deck for flexibility on card choice and tech cards. Some lists play Machina. Obviously, having the sword spell that from Uma that gives it Storm, you know, creates a very scary scenario where you don't necessarily always have to like push for like damage. You just get them, chip them a little bit, and if it gets late into the game, you can Machina them, and if they don't have any removal or any response, they kind of lose the game on the spot. I've had some turns come out where Machina comes out and it's just swinging in for like 15 damage, and I'm like, yeah, good game, thank you, GG. You know, after doing like one Stormfaller before that and into Machina, it's pretty obnoxious when that happens. There's also, I like the flexibility of the deck that if you decide not to play the Machina package and you want to play more of a, even more into the earlier tempo game plan, you can play Tigress in those decks to get the 4 storm damage in earlier. So if you feel like the meta needs to be a little faster and you don't want to go into too far of a late game and don't want to rely on Machina, because Machina itself is a very it's a very fragile finisher in that sense, because a lot of times if they just hold up 2 play points, they kind of threaten Surefire Bullet for that card. Instead of going to that, you can go into the Tigress stuff. So if on turn 3 is like, especially going first, their turn 2, they don't really play a really threatening thing on you. You can just simply go, well, next turn I'm going to Balion. So right now I'm going to go ahead and push up a Tigress, swing in for the 4 storm damage. If it lives, that's even more damage next turn. Otherwise, they're going to have to answer it. It's one of those cards, too, that's like you play things on the board. If your opponent isn't really advancing their game state, suddenly they have to answer your questions to be able to stay in the game. If they don't, you can take control of the game from there fairly easily. I'm going to put this into tier 1. I think this is like one of the better decks of the format to be playing, at least early on right now. It feels very strong. And I've been enjoying it the most out of all the decks. It's probably felt the most, I don't want to say, it's felt the most consistent of the decks that I have been playing personally. Mono is incredibly consistent as well. It's just, I think the play patterns of mono, you have to be really figured out. Like I said before, I keep going back to this, but I think it's really important to understand the matchups that mono's game plans are for those matchups and how to actually navigate those matchups to win. It's not a brain dead deck. Natra Sword, though, feels like you can make a mistake here or there. Small mistakes, of course. You can't make huge mistakes, otherwise the game's just over for you. But it does feel like you don't get punished too hard because your cards just feel very good. Mistalina is such a powerful card. It blowing up one big thing, basically dealing 6 damage somewhere to get through any wards or whatever, and then get a swing in for 7 usually for storm damage, which feels really good. And also for some reason heals you. Balion himself is a obnoxious version of Alice that has like 3 extra abilities on it for no reason. Like the card didn't need all these extra stuff for it. It just feels really good. And at the end of the day, like I said, I like the more of the customizability of Natra Forest. It definitely does feel like this is a type of deck where you don't feel as bad playing 1 and 2 ofs because you draw so much with this deck. It's a deck I highly recommend trying out if you're interested in playing playing one big body at a time. What's really nice about this deck too is like the game plan at the end obviously is just Mistalina as much as possible. But what's really cool about this deck also is that they still have to answer your board in a way. Unfortunately, this meta, a lot of people should be afraid of mono, so they should have some text tech to deal with board states like this. But if they ever leave Baleon on the board and stuff, you can run away with the game due to the way Baleon works, where you can sack a bunch of trees and just pump something up a bunch and swing in. Baleon is such an obnoxiously powerful card, and what makes this deck so good too, in my opinion, is the consistency of all the draw you get, draw ditch as well. I think that's why Natra kind of pulled ahead of all of the Machina stuff in general, is that the consistency of being able to draw ditch a bunch in a game. So you're going to see like at minimum 4 extra cards a game minimum, but you're going to see more than that for sure, just due to the packages that Natra runs. Means these Natra decks feel way better than they probably would be in any other state if they didn't have the draw ditch from the trees. Next here is Riley Dirt Rune. This deck, I've played only against it once. Unfortunately, Riley is just a really broken card. So even if I think the Dirt Rune deck itself isn't as powerful as it could be right now, and don't worry, for those that love Dirt Rune, your time to shine is coming up. I think it's in set 9 is when like the Riley Dirt Rune deck becomes basically the best deck in format by like a good margin. And I think there's only like one other deck that can semi-compete with the deck. But when we get that meta, that's your time to shine. But right now, I don't think it is. I think the deck is pretty solid overall still. I'm not 100% sure where I would place this. I think a lot of the time, like Riley for sure is carrying the deck a lot more. The fact that you get to draw 2 off the card, when it comes out 2, it gets kind of like, extra storm aggression on your opponent as well. So you have some extra reach. You're still able to play the golem package stuff because that stuff is still good. Burn damage and control, which feels really good. I'm not 100% sold on this deck being tier 3. Tier 2, but I think it's good enough to be in tier 2 right now. I might change my opinion later, like in a month from now. Maybe I'm like, what was I smoking? This crap is in tier 3 for sure. But for now, I'm just gonna throw it up into tier 3 here, tier 2, because I think Riley itself is so powerful that it can push its presence into tier 2 if people really work on the deck. Healing is very powerful in this meta, which means Gingerbread House is a really strong card for Dirt Rune, and the fact that things like concentration exists where you get to draw 2 and heal 3 feels very good. You still get to play some of the broken cards in Rune, being Merlin, for example, being able to loop spells, things like that, get some free spells that way. Riley adds consistency to the deck, because it gets to draw 2 cards every time it comes into play. Essentially, there's a lot of times like I feel fine like turn 3 you just play Riley because you need to draw cards in the hand. You pop a Dirt Rune, or you pop a Sediment on the board to draw 2 cards and go from there. It's still like a 3-5 or 3-6 or whatever. It's a very good card to like really work with. I think, like I said, I think it carries a lot of the weaknesses Dirt Rune has right now, and then eventually Dirt Rune will be able in a spot that can just kind of take control of the games. Verdant. All right, so Natra Dragon. I know I've been hyping up Natra a lot with like the first sword and forest list, but Verdant is probably the weakest of the bunch for Natra decks. One of the big issues after testing it a lot myself, I really like the way the deck plays. I like it a lot, honestly, and I wish it was way better than it was, but the deck does have some issues. If you don't see a Verdant early enough, you kind of just slowly lose the game. You got to get to a game state where you've like played multiple Verdants and possibly had, I think it's called Dragons, right? I forget, the amulet on board that deals 2 damage every time you discard a card. You got to get to the state of game where like you can put these on the board over and over again, and now you have like 3 things generating burn damage every turn. Then you kind of feel very good. A lot of the games where I only ever got 1 Verdant out did not feel good at all. They were really hard. I had to struggle a lot to find another Verdant eventually, and honestly, those games might be a little less like maybe just I had a bad set of games, but I feel like most games are going to play out this way. You either see enough Verdants to win the game, or you don't see Verdant on time, and then the game becomes so much struggle that you can't really win the game against these other tier 1 decks. Verdant, though, itself, I still think is a very powerful deck. Its game plan is still strong. The fact that you can't really stop it from burning you other than if you play Illyrial, I believe. That's like one of the few times it can like stop people from, or that can stop you from winning games. So you got to be aware of that. Luckily, this is a best of 1 game, so not a lot of people are going to like sideboard that card because there is no sideboard. But Verdant, I think the consistency with Verdant is kind of awkward from my playtesting so far, but I do think it's better than the things in tier 3, so I'm going to throw this up into tier 2 for now. That I might change my opinion. I know some people have it in tier 1. I think those people are kind of on copium in that sense. I think it's a very solid tier 2 deck. I don't think this really fights any other deck necessarily very well. I might be completely wrong on that. All the games I played on this deck were against decks like Natra Forest or Pixie Forest were the main decks I played this with against, and as well as I think I played a game or two against Mono or something as well. And it just once again feels like if you see the Valdanes early enough, you're good. If you don't, the game's going to be really hard until you can get Valdanes online. And sometimes the time it takes for Valdane to get online, once you miss those key turns, it can come out as soon as possible. It feels really, really bad. Because every turn you're just delaying your turn, since a lot of your damage comes from being able to end the turn and burn them for like 5 or more damage. When you have a couple of these when you have the amulet and like a Valdane thing in the EX zone to deal with damage. Next, Kuon. Kuon got hit really hard with a recent nerf in the sense that Curse Crafter has been limited to 1. It's still a really powerful card, but there is a new card that just came out. I wish I had the name of the card offhand, but it has a spell that goes along with it that basically has its Fire Chain, but if you have the character on board, it's Fire Chain but better, essentially. And so that kind of took the spot of Curse Crafter. So it in a way it kind of hurts consistency, but you still have the tools early enough in the game to like stop aggression and like that. I think Kuon does very well into matchups like Mono, for example, because you're going to be able to control the board a little better than other decks, because you only really care. You don't necessarily always like slam things to the board too quickly. It's more about setting up for your Kuon D-shift turns to really win those games. I'm kind of torn between where I really want to put this necessarily. It might be tier 1 and it might be tier 2. It's kind of in between for me right now. I still think this is one of the better late game decks in the sense that unlike other decks, if they didn't set up in time, their late game doesn't necessarily always have great impact. But Kuon, as always, can be like, it's turn 7, it's time to rock. We're gonna go ahead and slam a couple Kuons to the board and slam our D shift, and then that's enough to win games sometimes. I think for now, I'm going to put it into tier 2, but I think this deck can easily be tier 1 depending on how the meta shakes out. And maybe the meta is just too like mid-range aggression suddenly, Kuon can't really get there. There is a lot more healing technically in this meta too, which is an issue. Things like Mistalina being able to heal, as well as like any of the forest stuff, honestly. And then there's some minor healing from Mono and Sword and Forest as well. So like a lot of, and Machina Haven as well has some okay healing as well. But like, yeah, the fact that there is more healing present in this meta means that your reach as Kuon 2 is a little bit more of a struggle, I feel like, if they start getting heals off, especially if I think it's Setsu is the name of the card, or Sets from Natra Sword. It's not Natra Sword, sorry, Natra Forest, or Forest decks in general. That card is really, really powerful, and it's a generic beast that could be played. And the fact that it heals 4 and then can be buffed as well into a ward, it's a really powerful card that I won't be surprised if it sees play in almost every Forest deck as a tech card, as like a 2-1 split or something like that, or even a 1-1 split depending on what's going on. The fact that exists too is like part of the bane of the fact that Kuon might struggle a little bit, but like I said, maybe I could see it push its way back into tier 1 depending on how the meta does shake out, and if people are really playing a lot of healing or not, or things to stop Kuon. Finally, we have here is Control Abyss. The one thing about Control Abyss a lot of the times is that I think it's like the wild card where unfortunately Drooling Idiot Neanderthal can just like get enough discard early on that you're locked out of the game essentially, unless they make horrible misplays. And then other times, like, you get big brain people who can just pilot this deck when they don't see those discards like on curve that way, and can pilot their way through games and make your life a living hell essentially. One of the big things about the deck though that I think it has some weaknesses is that we have cards like Machina running around in some lists. Some dragon lists even play Machina, some Haven lists play Machina, forest lists play Machina, sword lists might play Machina. The kill spell that Machina has too is just a really powerful card, which means that things like Israfil, Death's Breath Israfil doesn't always guarantee you extra turns, essentially, because it could be just 3 costs removed immediately, and then they get to present something on the board and push damage that way, which I think is an issue. But the big power thing about the deck at the end of the day, and the reason why mono is as good as it is as well, is the fact that Gensetsu is a really powerful card into most things in the meta right now. Sword, one of Sword's biggest weaknesses is that it doesn't have very good consistent ways to really deal with wide boards, and if we're slamming 4 wards onto the board, it's really hard to deal with. The deck might struggle in a little bit into Natra Forest, just because of like the board clear stuff into the later game. Not 100% sure. I haven't seen that matchup play out too often just yet, and I haven't got to test it myself. But from testing so far, and from what I've seen of Control Abyss from other people in my play group playing it currently, thinking it might have more legs than it should. I think it's a really solid tier 2 deck as well. You can just throw it up here somewhere. I think at the end of the day, there are some weaknesses it has where, like, other decks, once again, have better finishing explosive turns built into their deck themselves. You can do the same thing with Control Abyss. You can start playing some out cards or something to kind of make up for that not having the great explosive power as you normally do, I think. But one of the big things the deck still struggles with on sometimes is wide boards as well, even though itself can build wide boards later in the game. Early game, if you play enough followers onto the board, they can't necessarily always like force you to discard. They're gonna have to use some of their time to deal with the board, because they can't necessarily, if you go like 3 to 5 followers on the board, it's a real struggle bus for them to deal with. One of the best ways they dealt with it before was Death Breath Israfil Evo swing in to clear the board, and then being left with a 10-10 ward. The other thing being Kawi. I think Kawi is still a very powerful card, but once again, it can be answered, and some of the decks that Kawi can do very well into, like for example, Machina. The biggest issue there is like a lot of the Machina followers and stuff, they're very, very weak followers. So yes, you will be able to force them to either like trade some type of hand advantage or some of their board in order to deal with the Kawi, but I think the heal as well isn't going to be as big or impactful like in other metas, like last meta, for example. I think Kawi was a really good call in all the Abyss lists that did run it at the time. But now I think with like the more mid-range game plan, I don't know how effective Kawi is going to be to really take control of every game that way. I think it's still a very powerful card. Into Sword, for example, once you play Kawi down, they can't play their Mistalina because you'll be forced to cast the Princess Strike spell or whatever it's called, and then deal 6 damage to it, and then they immediately get to remove your Mistalina and heal 4 off of that, and you've wasted your entire turn. One of the big issues though with that too is that I think once again Natra Forest feels like a very strong, powerful deck in this meta, and I think that the bounce, and they have access to some bounces and so forth if needed, and even into the Pixie Forest stuff, it can get bounced away as well. And then there are some Machina lists that do have some good banishing to get rid of things like Kawi like that as well, and they don't really care that much necessarily to deal with it. It'll be really interesting to see where Control Abyss ends. I do think I'm kind of erring on the side of caution here. The deck could be secret tier 1 as well. I'm not 100% sold on it just yet, but it definitely has the tools to really get there and really present pressure and everything to your opponent on the board. And like, it's good enough that I think into every matchup, it doesn't necessarily have horrible matchups into anything, but I also don't necessarily think it has the best matchup spread overall. It'll have some really good matchups into certain decks, but I think the spread overall is not good enough to push it into tier 1. But I could be 100% wrong here. I think the one thing about control decks, especially early on in metas, is that it takes time for them to truly figure out the exact perfect 40 cards into the meta, and that's where I'm kind of at right now. I'm not exactly sure what the perfect 40 cards are, and I don't know what tech cards need to be played to make sure the deck is very good into every matchup. But at the end of the day, the high rolls of the deck too also give it like a 50-50 almost into everything when you hit those high rolls. But when you hit the low rolls, you do still feel bad because you can kind of brick out depending on how the game goes. I'm sure if you've played the deck before in prior metas, you kind of know how it is, because in this meta it doesn't necessarily, I don't think it necessarily got any like huge upgrades. Really, you just got yeah, you're just kind of still playing the same package overall. The core of the deck at least is the same package as before. You did get I'm forgetting the card's name now. Dublame, I believe his name is. That card is actually really good. It's probably the best upgrade the deck got, because having removal on followers is really important in this type of game. You can't be using spells to remove things, because you unlike followers, they don't put pressure onto the board and pressure for your opponent or answers for your opponent to really deal with. That's why things like Themis kind of like slowly fill out, as well as that. Yes, clearing the board and removing anything you want necessarily is like a really good game plan, but you're spending your entire turn to clear the board and not putting a new threat onto the board, which means now your opponent gets time to like set up their next threat that you have to deal with. So unless you have like the perfect in-game like checkmate card, board wipes that don't put any pressure onto the board for your opponent to deal with are not that great anymore. But yeah, this is my initial thoughts of the tier list for set 7. I think Natra Forest, Natra Sword, and Mono are the 3 strongest decks in my opinion. I think Kuon and Control Abyss are probably fighting there to be the next tier 1 deck. I think if over time the control players figure out the exact 40 list, I think Control Abyss could probably pop into tier 1 as well. And yeah, I think with that being said, guys, I think this is it. Let me know what your thoughts are on my tier list and my thoughts of this current meta. I'd really like to hear what you guys have been thinking. I put a lot of thought into this meta because this is kind of the meta that is going to be the last meta essentially until Worlds. I think there's like one tournament that's going to be BP08, I think, essentially in California, and whatever is happening around that time for California, any of the other events around that time. But the rest of the season, I feel like this is going to be the meta to be dealing with. And also for anyone that might have questions like, oh, where's like Haven, Fable, and stuff like that on this list, I chose not to include any decks I didn't think are really worth talking about a lot, because either they didn't get a lot of extra cards that really matter in my opinion, or I don't think they're going to be played at a number that really reflects like having them put on the tier list necessarily for what the meta is going to be like. If you want my thoughts on any deck that is not on this meta or on this tier list and you think is worth talking about, feel free to put it in the comments below, and if I have anything worthwhile to say about those decks into this meta, I'll go ahead and leave a comment below your post in the comment section below. But with that being said, guys, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It keeps me motivated to keep making content like this, and I hope to get more deck profiles, match videos, and hopefully some other spicy stuff coming ahead for you guys to enjoy in the future. So with that being said, guys, I'll see you guys later.